So War Culture's theme today is distinctiveness, north or northeast. And we've become increasingly aware of the current government's pledge to level up the north, pledging investment in transport and infrastructure and other projects to narrow the gap between the UK's wealthiest and its poorest regions, all of which echoes rafts of reports highlighting the disparity between cultural spend in London and other areas. And while significant steps have been taken in the last decade or so by organisations like Arts Council England, the economic impact of COVID-19 and of Brexit draw into question whether levelling up is indeed an achievable goal. And in this context, it seems apposite to think about the distinctiveness in relation to the Northeast. How do we stand out and attract investment in this area, in this era of levelling up? Do we think of ourselves as part of the larger North? And if so, what are the advantages of this? In the environment, is it one of collaboration or is it one of competition? When some argue that the government's view of the North stops at Manchester, what is it that makes the Northeast distinctive? And how can we make that more visible? Those are some of the kinds of questions we might end up discussing today. But for now, let's crack on. So today we have two speakers up first, and each will give a short provocation, followed by a question and answer session at about 11 AM. And at 11:10, we'll all have a 5-minute break and reconvene at 11:15 when you'll join your breakout groups. 11:40, we'll gather again and I'll ask each breakout group to report back on its discussions. And at 12 noon, War Culture will end, but War Coffee will begin. So if you want to hang around at 12 and chat, rejoin breakout rooms, then please feel free to. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Keith Merrin is the director of Sunderland Culture that was formed by the University of Sunderland, Sunderland City Council, and the business community of the city to operate cultural venues and to deliver major projects. So over to you, Keith.
As Richard says, I'm the Chief Executive of Sunderland Culture. I'm also a board member of the Northeast Culture Partnership, and the sort of slightly blurry picture on the screen there has a point to it. It's not just me being vain. As these things go, I was asked to facilitate an event a couple of years ago around this question of distinctiveness for the Northeast Culture Partnership. And as a result of doing that event, I was then asked to chair what's called the Distinctiveness group of the Northeast Culture Partnership. So really that's my only qualification for talking to you today, although obviously I live in the Northeast and have spent a large part of my life here working in lots of different parts, which I'll talk about. Richard's kind of touched on both things that I'm going to talk about really. One is just to sort of talk a little bit about the work of the Distinctiveness group of and how that fits with the Northeast case for culture, and whether that works at a North or even a Northeast level. And then the second thing I'm going to talk about is where we are now in terms of advocacy for the cultural sector in the Northeast, and whether that's better done actually at a northern level rather than a Northeast level, and some of the things that are going on there. As Richard talked about, really, the North seems to be a big idea that's gaining kind of traction in the media at the moment, as particularly front of mind in that sort of levelling up discussion. I noticed that there's also a new political party that's launched, the Northern Independence Party, which is encouraging the North to break away from the rest of England. And you may have also spotted that we have a proposed monarch in Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham, who has been crowned the King of the North on social media. But I suppose for me, there's a question about whether that North really exists as a place, and is it somewhere that our communities, for example, would recognise as the North? But for that matter, do our communities actually recognise the Northeast? As I say, I've worked in South Tyneside, in Teesside, in Southeast Northumberland, and now in Sunderland. And certainly each of those places is very distinctive in its own right and sees itself as very distinctive. And it's hard to start to think about what it is that binds us together as a single region. And I suppose, as I mentioned, that was probably what drew me to facilitate that session a few years ago for the Northeast Culture Partnership, and as we started to work on the Northeast Case for Culture. The Case for Culture, as hopefully people are aware of it, it sits at the heart of the Northeast Culture Partnership. It's an advocacy document. And the Culture Partnership itself really was instigated in the dying days of the old Regional Development Agency, One Northeast, based on this idea that there was a momentum around the region's cultural regeneration that had taken place over a period of years. And that whilst those political structures were now changing, that identity of the Northeast does remain strong for the cultural sector. And that as a sector, we were best placed to use the Northeast to advocate and to be seen on a national and international stage. We were having a little debate before the session started actually about where the North starts and ends. For the Northeast Culture Partnership, that's quite straightforward. We operate across we talk about the Northeast as the 12 local authority areas from Northumberland down to Redcar. And actually, the picture that's used on the front of the Case for Culture is quite interesting because I suppose it's very difficult to try and find a single image that encapsulates even just the Northeast. So we ended up with 12 images which actually reflect all of the different local authority areas. But as we started to develop the Case for Culture, there was a huge consultation process of over 1,000 people from within the sector, from local authorities, businesses, universities, artists, freelancers, all sorts of people talking about the region and the sector. And I think what we concluded within that was that the region does have a distinct identity, but that actually more important than that identity was going to be key to the future of the region and to its thriving communities and economies. In fact, there are 5 priorities in this document, and distinctiveness is one of those priorities. The Case for Culture basically says that the Northeast is a distinctive and attractive place with a strong cultural identity. I'll just read a bit. It goes on to say that we want to build on this distinctiveness of place, of our rich natural and historic environment, so we become recognized internationally for the quality of life we offer, enabling our region to become an even more attractive and inspiring place to live and work. I suppose once we got that document, we all kind of agreed that the distinct identity of the Northeast was something that we should all focus on. But then what became really clear was that nobody actually agreed on what that distinct identity was and what the region really looks like. And I think even more than that a lot of people were quite dissatisfied with the narratives that were being constantly rolled out for the Northeast, and that people really didn't see themselves in that. They didn't resonate with their lives as people living in the Northeast, whether that was kind of the industrial past that we often talk about, our perceived character traits, the welcoming Geordies or Mackhams or whatever, or whether that was that sort of coast and castles type imagery. People just weren't seeing themselves reflected in that. And I think, as I say, that was true not just of external narratives, and we all kind of see those stereotypes that are often thrust on us, but also the internal narratives, the stories we were telling ourselves about the region. So as I say, I was asked to chair the Distinctiveness group, and we started to look at this to see whether we could try and dig into what this identity really is and how we could then use that to benefit the region. The main outcome of this work, actually, I'm not going to talk about because Anna's going to talk about that in a minute, which is the new narratives of the Northeast Project. But the most important thing about this was the idea was to gain multiple perspectives of that Northeast identity, both to kind of stimulate some debate, but also to act as a kind of a knowledge bank of themes and thoughts and messages, which we could then take forward in how we portray our region, a much more nuanced approach to showing off what the Northeast is all about. And like I say, all of this work is kind of predicated on the idea that the Northeast still works as a region and identifies as a region. And I suppose that's becoming increasingly difficult to navigate in terms of the region's political structures. The Northeast Culture Partnership itself is probably one of the only things that really works across the Northeast as we might know it. As I mentioned, we got the 12 separate local authorities, 3 combined authorities, 2 local enterprise partnerships, which means that the priorities and pressures in those areas can vary enormously And then there are other things going on. The Borderlands growth deal sees Northumberland working much more closely with Cumbria and the Scottish borders. When we get to the kind of northern level, there's a whole other layer of initiatives and structures which we now need to take into account. Many of the structures that we already work within, I suppose, as a sector operate in that way. I mean, Arts Council, National Lottery Heritage Fund, others see the North as a single region. And whilst the Northern Powerhouse is less talked about these days, there is an active partnership of the 11 local enterprise partnerships in the North, the NP11, which is setting an agenda for investment. This is their manifesto for the North. And I think what's striking about the manifesto for the North is its expression of the North's assets. So in addition to the distinct economic and industrial strengths, you start to see these other things which we might recognize. A strong sense of identity rooted in a culture that celebrates our individual places and our common Northern heritage. I'll come back to that. Proud people with wit and grit, I quite like that, and our phenomenal natural assets. So again, a cultural expression of the assets of the entire North. I suppose, as I say, as someone who's been steeped in the Northeast as a place, that I kind of instinctively, I suppose, rail against that idea of a common Northern heritage, but that's maybe just me. I mentioned earlier that we were having a bit of a debate about where the North actually is and how you would define it. This happened to just pop up in my Twitter feed this morning, so I added it into my presentation, which is something that was done during the Great Exhibition of the North a few years ago. I'm sure that'll come up in our discussions later. And actually, you can't see it on this map, but it goes right down to Derby as being the North. As Richard said at the start, I suppose what's maybe changing my views a little bit about whether we should be thinking on a northern or a northeastern basis is that this context is now changing. And the COVID crisis, I suppose, has really shone a light on the need for levelling up between parts of the country. And I think what I'm starting to see is commonalities for us as a sector across the North as well. I think it's really clear that the North has been disproportionately affected by COVID and continues to be, and that the entire North will suffer in the recession that's to come. As we perhaps today move into tier 3, that it will be the North again in our sector that is being hit by more lockdowns. Might have venues in Sunderland, for example, in tier 3 wouldn't be reopening to the public. As a northern sector, we are very reliant on local authority funding within the cultural sector, and I think that's a common issue across the North. Also, we have a huge reliance on a freelance workforce, which in itself is facing huge hardship and damage. And also, I suppose one of those common things across the sector in the North is the partnerships with universities. Great example today, obviously, about that. And our universities, of course, are also really suffering significant stress through the COVID-19 crisis. I suppose what's also clear is the role that the cultural sector in the North has to play in that recovery process, in rebuilding the economic recovery of our towns and cities and rural areas, but also rebuilding confidence in our communities. So is the North where to go? I suppose I'm increasingly starting to think that perhaps there is something to be gained from speaking with one voice as a cultural sector in the North. I was recently invited to join a series of meetings of a new Northern Cultural Network, a kind of partnership of cultural partnerships from across the North. And the aim of this group is to try to identify those areas of commonality, but also to advocate for investment and support in the sector. At the same time, there's a new all-party parliamentary group for Northern culture being formed. At an initial scoping meeting that I went to, it was really heartening to hear from politicians of all parties actually recognising that culture is central to the identity and distinctiveness of the North and in need of specific support. I suppose it is a bit of a balancing act. There is a risk in a wider North collaboration that we start to lose our own identity as the Northeast. Richard talked about the North stopping at Manchester, and I think if you look at the scale of the cultural sector in the Northeast versus, say, the Northwest. In the Northwest, it is of clearly of a much bigger scale and receive, much larger amounts of funding. So I think there is a risk that our voice becomes diluted in that. But given the commonalities that we have, there does seem to be some potential that by collaborating and talking as the wider North, we can start to make an impact. I suppose in conclusion, I struggle a little bit with the idea of the North as having a common identity, but I suppose the work that we've done through the Culture Partnership and the Distinctiveness group has made me think, well, it's hard to really define what the Northeast identity is, so maybe that's not so important, and that our job really is to try and surface those multiple narratives from across our communities and work really to deliver benefit wherever we can in that way. So that's it from me.
Thank you so much, Keith. Wonderful words. It leaves me wondering whether being from the North is more about a state of mind than a place. Anyway, thank you ever such a lot. And now can I ask Anna Disley, who's our next speaker, to prepare to present. Anna's the Executive Director for Programme and Impact at New Writing North and the Chair of Unfolding Theatre based in Newcastle. Anna's responsible for New Writing North's work with young people, with schools and communities, and she leads on all the theatre and script development work that they're involved in, and leads on their partnerships with the BBC and Channel 4 around talent development, as well as Northumbria University's Crime Story Festival. So Anna is enormously busy, and I'm enormously pleased to welcome her to hear her thoughts today. Over to you, Anna.
Thanks, Keith, for that. It's a really good opener for my presentation, which is about New Writing North's programme called The New Narratives for the Northeast. And this came out of a concern which New Writing North has had for a number of years about who speaks for the Northeast nationally, especially since the demise of regional infrastructure and also the rise of the Northern Powerhouse, where sometimes we felt perhaps we were drowned out by the Northwest and Yorkshire. And at the same time, we felt perhaps the stories that the outside world perceive about us are perhaps just one or two, that perhaps once we were a proud industrial region that is now post-industrial. And perhaps even we were becoming more famous for our post-industry than our industry. And of course, these are important stories that we need to keep hold of and we need to tell again and retell. But there are other narratives, and there are other voices that should be speaking for the region and helping to articulate something of its future, as Keith alluded to in his talk. And we thought perhaps the cultural sector had a role in that. So in our case, we turned to writers. And with the help of the Northeast Cultural Partnership and the Heritage Lottery Fund, we were able to commission 15 writers to write their narratives of the Northeast, sorry, narratives for the Northeast. So there were journalists, poets, fiction writers, narrative non-fiction, and those 15 writers including 2 young writers. We commissioned those 15 pieces, and we also made 3 podcasts sort of drawing on the themes that came out of those pieces. And this presentation is me attempting to outline some of the themes that came through the pieces. I mean, the best thing to do is to listen to the podcasts and read the pieces, but I'm hopefully going to kind of give you a little bit of a sum up of some of the themes that came through. I won't be able to go through them all in detail. So beginning with David Armand, David Armand wrote Sing the North, which was a poetic anthem for the region, really. He wrote it during lockdown in Bath, and he hadn't meant to. He wanted to walk the beaches of Northumberland as he intended, but instead of doing that, he had to imagine them. And so taking us on a sweeping journey as a bird flying across the broad, pale beaches, the Durham Hills, distant moors, ancient castles, mining towns and solid steel and stone cities of his Northeast, he says, tell them to come up here with the skylark, to forget what they know and to look down on the vastness of the North. Tell them that this is where they might come if they wish to be rewilded. And with this, David talks about how he has to write himself there, to the edge of the world, he says. And this idea of edge, or a region apart, was common among many of the pieces. So Juliana Mensah, in her piece, The Real Bernicians, or How to Create a Country, a short story, imagines a group of disillusioned millennials from diverse backgrounds laying claim to a piece of land between Northumberland and Scotland that everyone's forgotten about. And they put a flag in the ground and create their own country from scratch, with all the decisions about the traditions from their cultures they should adopt, the national food, how to practice democracy, what their constitution is there one? And similarly, Bronwyn Riley talks about the significance of edges and boundaries and borders. Hadrian's Wall reminding us of the brutal border between Scotland and England, and in that long history, perhaps the edginess that stayed with us all. She's written an account of Bretons, a Syrian soldier stationed on the bleak sea salt windswept Hadrian's Wall, and his relationship with a free slave woman from southern England called Regina. There's a monument to her from him in Arbea Roman Fort at South Shields, which you can see when it's open. And she says her story has become one of poignant love between two displaced people, careless evidence for a happy mixed marriage in multicultural Britain. Riley charts the many contemporary parallels in this story, including the story of migrants to the northeast, and how the region welcomes 3 times as many migrants as London and the southeast, based on our population size. She, as do many writers, identify the northeast as always having been a place of cultural exchange, even since Roman times. And because of the sea. So Carmen Marcus also echoes this idea of cultural exchange with her prose poem Finfolk. She wanted to tell the story of the North not as a region with boundaries, but as a place from the perspective of the sea, a sort of borderless place. And actually, as Richard sort of alluded to before, perhaps a place of the imagination. She talks about a sea goddess emerging from the ocean in search of the mythical North. And she says, if you go in search of the mythical North, perhaps you just keep moving around the world. It's a place with no boundaries. Lauren Davis also wrote about the sea, and very specifically the surfing community that's grown up from quite idiosyncratic beginnings in the late 80s, when surfers used to wear marigold gloves and woolen scarves instead of wetsuits. Now surfing is thriving and a place where people from across communities can commune with nature, and also look back from the region from the perspective of the sea, with its Roman souvenirs and ancient castles that are set against the industrial heritage of our ports. She mentions in her piece an old miner who stops to tell her about the mine that he worked in, which went way out to sea underneath where she surfed. Our industrial history is never far from the surface in many of the pieces, and actually quite a long way under the surface in this case. Andrew Hankinson was not alone amongst the writers in talking about how he felt alienated by the narrative of our industrial past. Although he's very interested in it and felt it was important to understand it, he says growing up in the 80s and 90s, it felt even then as part of a bygone age. And that's why he chose to write about shopping and the metro centre, the once great hope of a regenerated northeast with its food court and fun fair. Richard Benson's piece was commissioned actually by the local enterprise partnership, who were interested in looking at innovation in the region. Richard, when he began, began writing on the project. Thought, like many, that the Northeast was trapped by its own history. But having interviewed people working on the manufacture of wind turbines on the Tyne, he comments, I am not sure that even people in the region understand the area is a world leader. Not a national leader, a world leader in renewable energy in the manufacture of wind turbines. He goes on to say that given that Aberdeen built its fortune on servicing oil rigs rather than oil itself, and given that there is said to be enough wind in the North Sea to power all of Europe, then this servicing alone should represent a potentially vast economic benefit. He then says or suggests, you have to feel that some places would make more of this, but as we know, this place doesn't brag. Richard suggests that we're going through a new industrial revolution, or we could say we are just going through a new phase of the old one, and that this has been a 200 to 300 year process. We are dealing with the need to carbonise, and carbonisation began in the Northeast. Renewables are possibly a continuation of that project. Alex Niven, whose piece on transport and its sorry state in 2020 Northeast also talks about our modern heritage of embracing science, engineering and technology that is different from the stereotypes of the English tradition. Somehow, Richard Benson suggests, it feels more native and natural in the Northeast to talk about problem solving. It doesn't sound as fancy as creativity or innovation, but most of the time it comes down to the same thing. So perhaps we lack confidence, as some have suggested, or maybe just stubbornly see ourselves as a region apart, secure in our history and culture, which is older and more venerable than that of London. There is a sense that we need to keep the Northeast a secret, or every bugger else will want to come. Richard Benson suggests that cities to the south of M62 perceive themselves to be in competition with London, but the Northeast is happy to be an autonomous region. To stand alone is important, he says. It sets you apart from the creeping blandness of 21st century life. However, there is a perception that people in London think we are on the corner of the world, an awkward place to get to. Perhaps it's associated with grime and industry, and often they're surprised when they get here. Lindsay Eyre in her piece says, I began to imagine that I felt out of place because of the city where I lived. In songs, books and films, people left the North for London to lose themselves and to find themselves again, smarter, richer, better looking, happier. Certainly, as has been said, we have in recent years been subject to neglect as a region. Recent figures released show the Northeast as the region with the lowest per capita increase in government spending of all the regions, languishing at 0.8%, with London at the top at 3.7%. There is a suggestion that you have to leave to get your voice heard. Richard T. Kelly in his piece asks, politically, who speaks up for the Northeast? Recognising at the time the most influential figure is Dominic Cummings, a man of Durham, that cathedral city and a place of learning, which is surrounded by some of the poorest post-industrial communities in the country, communities Cummings claims to understand. I don't know why there it is, yeah. And in DH1, A Tale of Two Cities, recent graduate Melissa Tutsigeni makes a plea for plurality, as we'll hear more of later. She says she hopes Durham will become a place of more than two types of people, those who always have been there and those who will never stay. And perhaps that is the conclusion we can draw from all of the writer's contributions, as Juliana Mensah says. People aren't caricatures of their identity. There is more than that. If you are starting from the Northeast, it is the centre of your world. We need a plurality, simple as that, not in terms of geography, but also race, religious background, disability. Lisette Orton, in her Angry, Powerful, Energising the River Cycle, calls for disabled people to be able to take up the cultural space in the Northeast that they are due, especially given the 25% of the population have a disability. I haven't talked about the warmth of the people, the female flaneur walking the streets of Newcastle evoking Julie Christie, Jean Seberg or Virginia Woolf, Mim Skinner's Refuse Cafe in Chester Street, a place of connection and stories, India Hunter's tribute to Stockton-on-Tees and Bethan Curley's poem about the West End. I also haven't mentioned the accent. All of these things come up quite regularly in the pieces. What many of the writers did talk about in their interviews was the vibrancy of the art scene and the creative people living here. that are sometimes under-acknowledged both within the region and nationally. Surely it is here, surely it is amongst these people that we should be looking to articulate something of our distinctiveness. The cultural sector has a significant role to play in this. Not only the stories of artists and practitioners working in the sector, but also through our connections with communities in the Northeast. This is how we can hear a plurality of voices, providing alternative or new narratives for a proud and hopeful future. I don't know if I've got a bit of time. I probably haven't. I'm over time, but I will just play you a final excerpt from one of the podcasts, which I do recommend you listen to because there's some lovely things in there. Just to finish.
I'm seeing a real change at the moment in the Northeast and a confident voice emerging of people who want to tell and unearth stories that have never been told before. And I think as long as we keep taking the power to tell our own story in our own way, there's a really interesting future for the Northeast. As long as we keep resisting the stories that are told about us, the stories that diagnose us, the stories that want to reinvent us. And I would like to see for a future of the Northeast, the boundaries between those borders of Yorkshire, Northumberland. I'd like to see those boundaries disintegrate in the way the sea disintegrates things. I'd like to see conversations happening between our commonalities and our differences. And I'd like to see us looking over the sea to those other shores and building connections. That's where I am with the Northeast at the moment. I'm all anticipation to sit around a fireside and hear what those stories will be.
That was Carmen Marcus, one of the writers, but thank you.